Hello, and welcome to another Veramed webinar. Today we'll be talking about pragmatic trials. What are they and how can they help you conduct hybrid trials? So with that, I'd like to introduce the speakers. First off, I'm delighted that Thomas Kumke could join us today. Thomas is the Statistical Science and Innovation Real-World Evidence Strategy Lead at UCB, and he has over 20 years of experience as a statistician. He's passionate about statistical analyses of observational studies, causal modeling, missing data analysis, multivariate statistics, and pragmatic trials in immunology. This year, he is a co-author on a paper that was released about a validation of pragmatic trial tool from GetReal, which I'm sure he will share with you later in his presentation. His keen interest in pragmatic trials has inspired me to learn about cluster randomized trials, which I'm excited to share with you later on in the presentation as well. I'm a principal statistician at Veramed, and I've got extensive experience in the pharmaceutical industry, and have happily dedicated the last 10 of those years to real-world evidence and observational research studies. To start things off, I thought we could start with a poll question just to understand a little bit about the experience of the audience here. And the question is coming to you shortly. How many real-world evidence studies have you been involved in? So it looks like about half of the audience have none but interest, which is excellent to hear. A good proportion, 40%, also have 1 to 5. There's a few people out there that have 6 to 10, and a small handful that have too many to count. So a nice distribution across them. I'm also interested in understanding a little bit about what type of background do you have? So there will be one more poll question, and it will be coming up shortly. But it's what would you consider your area of expertise to be? Ooh, excellent. There's a large 90% that have statistics or statistical programming background, some medical affairs, a market access, and one with something else that's intriguing. Excellent. So without further ado, I think that we understand our audience a bit better. And with that, I will hand over the screen and presentation to Thomas, who will talk about pragmatic trials.
Hello, and thank you very much, Rachel, for this nice introduction. And I will need to share my screen. And I hope you can all see my screen. So thank you for this nice introduction, and thank you, Veramed, for giving us, Rachel and myself, the opportunity to talk about pragmatic trials. I think it's a very important topic, and which came actually up within the last 10 to 15 years in both the methodology and also the application. So although pragmatic trials, I think the first mentioning was actually 50 years ago, but it took some time that the importance of those type of studies were recognized, and with the development of the methodology, also the applications were starting to come in, and we do see a few pragmatic trials nowadays conducted in various indications. Before we talk about pragmatic trials, let's go a little bit back, and let's go a little bit back to evidence generation and look where are the evidence gaps? There are any. So most of the evidence, I think, will be addressed either via randomized clinical trials or via observational studies. While randomized clinical trials, they test a hypothesis about the treatment in an experimental setting. It involves randomization and blinding and restrictive exclusion criteria typically. And the main question is, can treatment work? On the other hand, observational studies, they test a hypothesis about a treatment in real-life setting, typically non-randomized and unblinded, and patients are included from a very broad, typically the real-life population. And the main question is, does treatment work? So the question, can treatment work, leads us to efficacy and a hypothesis testing of the cause effect of the drug, while the question, does treatment work, leads us to effectiveness and the comparison of treatment strategies. There are still some sources of uncertainty, and from every stakeholder in principle, typical examples of such uncertainties can come from prescribers. Is the new treatment an optimal treatment for the patient? Patients could ask what to expect from a new treatment. And decision makers can, of course, ask, is there an added value of the new treatment? So that are all relevant questions, and pragmatic trials can serve here as a bridge between randomized clinical trials and observational studies, depending on the research question and the objectives of a trial. So they can serve as a bridge in a way that they are very flexible in design, and they can be either more similar to a randomized clinical trial, so you can shift the pragmatic trial to the left-hand side of the picture, or it can be more similar to an observational study when shifting the pragmatic trial more to the right-hand side of the picture. All is a matter of the research question, of the objectives, and of the trial design. So pragmatic trials are very flexible, but what are they? They aim to assess the relative effectiveness of a treatment strategy in clinical practice by maintaining the strength of comparisons of clinical trials. They compare randomized groups of patients in a setting similar to routine clinical practice. They assess differences in treatment strategies by including the potential impact of extraneous factors, for example, co-medications or non-adherence. And the aim is to increase the generalizability of the results by broadening the patient population, and depending on the setting, pragmatic trial can be more similar to a randomized clinical trial or an explanatory trial. And from that point onwards, I'm just referring to explanatory trial when I am meaning randomized clinical trials, or to an observational study. And the aim is to guide physicians and policymakers in choosing the optimal treatment. And that is a very important aspect. The aim of a pragmatic trial is guiding physicians and policymakers in choosing the optimal treatment for the patient. And I think Rachel has now another poll for you.
What do you consider the most important evidence gap to be that is typically not addressed by either clinical trials or observational studies? There's a handful that have added value of a new treatment for patients is the key gap of evidence. Followed by evidence generation to address the patient's need for information on a new treatment is the most important. And the one lagging behind the most is clinical trials and observational studies close all evidence gaps in my area.
Yeah, that is a very interesting result, and I think it shows that we are all patient-centric, isn't it? Yeah. I think some results from a viewpoint of probably market access came in, added value. That is typically a question from market access, but yeah, the patient centricity is very important. So what actually brings a new treatment to me as a patient? It's very interesting.
It's nice to see as a patient. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I'll close the poll now and hand it back over to Thomas.
Okay. Let's go into a little bit into more details with the pragmatic trials, and let's talk a little bit about the so-called pragmatic explanatory continuum, because that is the basic concept of pragmatic trials. And to understand these specifics, it's really important to look at a few design choices of trials. And let's start with the eligibility. And when we talk about eligibility, we do have typically a few choices. Either we we highly select patients from a very selective patient population, or we look at the target population of clinical practice. And the highly selected patients leads us to a trial which is more explanatory, while the target population clinical practice is more pragmatic choice. Similarly to the trial setting, if we select very specialized centers for our trial, so it will lead to a more explanatory trial, while inclusion of more routine care sites or ternary sites will lead us more to a pragmatic choice. Treatment adherence is another important design choice. We can either apply strict measures of adherence, which would lead us to an explanatory trial, while having no measures or just minimal measures of adherence is more a pragmatic choice. And finally, let's look at the outcome measures. If we select an outcome measure that demonstrates the biologic effect, of course, we do have an explanatory trial at hand, while outcome measures that support more the decision-making in clinical practice is more a pragmatic choice. At the end of the day, in reality, pragmatic and explanatory trials represent both ends of a continuum rather than being a binary choice. So we do not necessarily need to select either trial specialized centers or routine care sites. We can select something in between, and the trial designer is always very flexible in pragmatic trials to select according to the needs of the trial. So the study designer is always capable to pick elements from both ends. And these both ends represent this pragmatic explanatory continuum. To support a pragmatic trial design, the pragmatic explanatory continuum indicator summary, so the so-called PRECIS, has been developed by Thorpe and by Loudon in 2009 and was then extended and modified in 2015. And the so-called PRECIS wheel consists of multiple design domains in a spider diagram, enabling the trial designer to determine whether the trial is located in that continuum. So I will show you that by showing the PRECIS 2 wheel taken from the publication of Loudon et al. In 2015. So that diagram consists of 9 dimensions: eligibility, recruitment, the setting of the trial, the organization, so what expertise and resources are needed to deliver the intervention, the delivery of the intervention, adherence, how is it measured, follow-up of the patients, the primary outcome, and the primary analysis. Remember, in the previous slide, I picked up 4 of those design dimensions. So, and each dimension is here in that spider diagram rated by Likert scale ranging from 1 being very explanatory to 5 very pragmatic. So if you design a pragmatic trial very close to an explanatory trial, your spider diagram would be very narrow, would result in a very narrow diagram around the origin. While if you design a very pragmatic trial, your spider diagram would be very broad. In reality, in practice, each dimension might be different because you might select a very broad eligibility of participants, but you might have other dimensions that are more close to an explanatory trial. So all is possible, and the truth is somewhere in between. Pragmatic trials come with a number of challenges, and there are also potential solutions to that. I selected here the top 5 challenges and present you potential solutions, first of all, from operational point of view, and then we look what statisticians can do. So one of the main challenges of pragmatic trials, they do not have typically no visit schedule, and they typically have no strategies to keep patients in the trial. Operationally, you can address this by reducing burden for the patients, keep the trial duration to a minimum, that will help, and also define time windows for data collection. Low treatment compliance is another challenge in pragmatic trials. Here you can operationally measure drug compliance in detail, collect information data on drug dispensing, and provide thresholds for drug compliance. Heterogeneity of standard care sites and consequently heterogeneity of data collection is another challenge. And here you could involve site representatives at trial startup, consider site selection by random sampling, of course, and or assess sites for quality of data collection and implement a data quality plan. Absence of blinding at site level and the absence of blinding of treatment is another challenge. Here you could consider a cluster randomized trial instead, and that is the topic that is Rachel's topic for later on. You could use objective endpoints to minimize bias, and you could consider blinding the sector. And finally, nothing to underestimate is the physician's subversion and preference for treatment. And here you could identify eligible patients before you randomize them, or you could consider alternatives types of randomization, which would lead again to a cluster randomized trial. Let's look what statisticians can do. No visit schedule and no strategies to keep patients will lead us to missing data. And of course, statisticians know how to run a comprehensive missing data analysis. They know also how to run sensitivity analysis for missing data patterns. And also they can implement sensitivity analysis using varied visit windows. Low treatment compliance can be addressed by adjusting the analysis for compliance and also run sensitivity analysis accounting for compliance. Heterogeneity of standard care sites and data collection. Here we can, as statisticians, we can account in the analysis for inter-site differences, and we can also run weighted analysis to adjust for overrepresentative sites. The absence of blinding at site level and blinding of treatment. Here we can describe dropout rates in more detail. We can describe the treatment compliance, and we can also adjust the analysis for protocol and treatment compliance. And finally, physician subversion and preference. We should describe the baseline characteristics to explore potential selection bias. We should assess the imbalance between the treatment groups, and we can also perform interaction tests by preference. So, and I think now Rachel has another poll.
What do you consider the most important challenge in pragmatic trials? And if you need to refer to the 5 different options that Thomas presented, those are the various options to select from. Oh, we're getting some results in. So right now, the top option is no strategies for keeping patients in the trial. And that was quickly surpassed by heterogeneity of sites and of data collection. Then the next option is absence of blinding, and then treatment preferences of physicians. And the least important challenge, according to the audience, is lack of treatment compliance.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. We do have a majority here as statisticians, and when I talk to statisticians on pragmatic trials, quite often the absence of blinding seems to be a big issue. Here it is the heterogeneity, which is very important because the heterogeneity of standard care sites triggers also the heterogeneity in data collection. So it's a very important issue because you really need to have comparable data. And we do have some measures and means to address that. And I think here especially important is really the operational solutions in the study startup. And that's what we also typically do in clinical trials. So we typically do have data quality plans in place. We do have representatives at the sites to make sure that data is collected and documented in the same way. So, but it's really interesting, really interesting.
Indeed.
Okay, let's continue. So, what does the community say? Pragmatic trials, I mentioned that have increased their importance, popularity during the last 10 years. And I did a little bit of a Google search in clinicaltrials.gov. And here I found around about 1,800, 1,900 studies that had the keywords pragmatic trials, pragmatic randomized control trials, somehow pragmatic in their title. And that's not a lot. I also looked up PubMed, and what I noticed there is an exponential increase during the last 8-10 years in publications related to pragmatic trials. So they are on the rise, but there's still a lot of reservation from regulators, market access authorities on the use of pragmatic trials due to the challenges I have outlined. But they are working with task force initiatives to work out the usefulness of pragmatic trials. I think the FDA also has one task force called Project Pragmatica. Didn't see any more than the announcement of the project itself, but I think there is some movement also from regulators' point of view. One of the initiatives I worked on was the IMI project Get Real. The Get Real project and later on initiative has been running since 10 years up to 2021 as I am under the IMI umbrella. And in 2021, the non-profit organization, the Get Real Institute, has founded. And the main purpose of the Get Real project was to promote real-world evidence. And one of the main task forces of Get Real was on pragmatic trials. And one of the main outcomes of that initiative was the development and validation of the Get Real trial tool. I think Rachel has mentioned that a little bit earlier on. And I would actually briefly introduce you to the Get Real trial tool, because that is very similar to that what we have seen from the Presses wheel. So the Get Real trial tool allows the user to assess the impact of design choices on generalizability of a trial in routine clinical practice, their possible implications, and potential operational challenges. So that's all what we talked about during the last 15 minutes or so. Design choices of the Get Real trial tool are based on the Presses 2 wheel, and they include the dimensions participant, outcome, comparator, data, safety, and quality. The number and brackets are the question related to each of these dimensions. So participant, there are 5 questions related to participant, 6 to site, etc. The tool assessment is based on the following dimensions: generalizability, risk of bias, precision, patient, prescriber, regulator, HTA body, ethical, cost, and duration. Not each dimension will be applicable to every of the questions. We will see it quite on the next slide. So each assessment of the individual questions is described and supported also by references, and the trial designer is pointed to those references. So we Get Real trial tool offers a decision support system for trial designers and practitioners. So that's how the potential output of the Get Real trial tool looks like. I made a test with one of Rachel's trials, and you see here the dimensions on the top, and then the categories of the questions with 5 questions for participants, 6 for sites, and so on for outcome, comparator, data, etc. And the outcome of the Get Real trial tool works in a traffic light system. So green is the optimal choice, orange is opportunity for improvement, and red more improvement. And there are flags then for those questions where potential problems come up, potential challenges come up. And here in Rachel's trial, the Get Real trial tool found 20 design choices for which Rachel may encounter operational challenges in her trial. So Rachel could now go into the software and look what does the system offer for solutions, how are they backed up with references, etc. It's a very useful tool, especially for trial designers. So what's the story so far? Pragmatic trials can be an important asset if the research questions cannot be answered by explanatory trials or observational studies. They are very flexible in as they can be very similar to explanatory trials or observational studies. Pragmatic trials have a few operational and statistical challenges. However, there are methods in place to address them. They have increased their popularity over the last decade, but they still have very limited acceptability from regulator and market access bodies. That is a slow change currently. And I know from my work with Get Real that there are some signs from regulators, especially from the FDA, but also from market access body like NICE, to accept more the pragmatic trials for regulatory or market access purpose. I also work, for example, for German market access, and here I think there is a little bit pressure on market access authority also from the politics to use all evidence which is available. You should not underestimate that politicians are not so really happy, health politicians are not so very happy that that market access bodies quite often say, okay, we don't have enough evidence, but then they don't use all available evidence. And I have been in workshops where politicians really required from the market body use all the evidence, and pragmatic trials, of course, one of them. So we are on the rise. So it is a slow change, but it is a change. And overall, pragmatic trials provide a good alternative to close evidence gaps left by clinical trials and observational studies. So my talk was very general, and I think Rachel will have some more specifics for you when she talks about cluster randomized trials.
I will be discussing cluster randomized trials, which Thomas nicely touched on in his Pragmatic Trials section. So I'm going to go through several considerations for conducting a cluster randomized trial. And when I was doing some research on cluster randomized trials, I found it very interesting that there's this golden rule that methods that apply to individually randomized trials rarely apply to cluster randomized trials, which is kind of confusing because they both have randomized and very similar acronyms. So hopefully this presentation will demystify how they're different and need to be thought and conducted in a different manner than the tried and true individually randomized trials. So I'll go through study design and bias, sample size calculations, and statistical analyses, particularly for those statisticians and programmers amongst us in this webinar. So cluster randomized trials are a popular choice for pragmatic trials. They're one of the types of trials that fall under the umbrella of pragmatic trials. And they are aligned with pragmatic trials in that they facilitate the evaluation of interventions in representative populations and under real-world conditions where there will be non-adherence, lack of compliance, and co-interventions, along with all the other interesting things that happen in a more real-world setting. So on the left of the screen here, you have your randomized control trial. And in that, we have all these different individuals, and they are typically randomized to different interventions. So in this case, we have intervention 1 and intervention 2. What makes the cluster randomized trial on the right slightly different is that these are different sites, and these sites can be different sizes. They could have different types of units, different locations, but there's many different aspects about them. And in a cluster randomized trial, we are randomizing the sites to different intervention arms. So in this example, we have some of the sites randomized to intervention 1 and some of the sites randomized to intervention 2. Then the subjects that report to those different sites are then part of the allocation of that randomization as well. So why would you consider a cluster randomized trial? They're commonly selected for logistical and budget reasons, but there could possibly be ethical reasons as to why a cluster randomized trial would be used. For logistic reasons, if there's a high risk of contamination when the individuals are randomized, so for example, maybe one physician, it could contaminate multiple different interventions, and in that case, it's easier to just randomize the physician to either one arm or the other arm, and then all the patients that report to that physician will be allocated to the same randomization as the physician. There could be budget reasons. Perhaps there's access to active interventions is very costly, and this is a method to saving the budget. And there can also be ethical reasons. So, for example, if informed consent from individuals is difficult to obtain, maybe due to the education that the physician they have or they see has. So as you can see, cluster randomized trials also evaluate a wide range of interventions. In yellow, we have the cluster level, so perhaps there's a change to hospital practices that we'd like to understand better. In the middle, we have professionals within a cluster level could be randomized. So as I mentioned, healthcare providers or physicians perhaps were interested in some education that they received. We can also look at the individual level, and these can be your classic drug interventions. However, with these benefits, there's an increased risk of bias, a lack of statistical precision, and larger sample sizes, which I will cover shortly. I'd also like to point out that assessing vaccine effects using cluster randomized trials has become more common. So cluster randomized trials are often used to assess vaccine effects. And this is possibly because of the interference. So when one patient's allocated treatment influences the outcome of another patient, that is of interest, particularly in regards to herd immunity. So clustering helps when we can't make this assumption. The type of vaccine trial I will describe here is a trial where individuals choose whether to participate in the trial or not. And while some individuals may choose not to participate in the trial, it's valuable if outcome data can be collected on all the individuals, as this allows the inference about different effects of the vaccine to be assessed. I'd also like to note that it's common in cluster randomized vaccine trials for the control to be another vaccine that is not expected to affect the outcome of interest. And for simplicity, I'll call these controls. The presence of the control allows for study blinding, and more on this on the next slide. So individuals in the cluster did not know which assignment their cluster received. When we look at the different control and treatment boxes I have at the bottom, so these are many different clusters that were either allocated to the control or the treatment. There are several important treatment effects to assess. You could look at the total effect. This measures the effect of the treatment in those that opted to receive the vaccine. So in my example here, that's the little syringe, I guess, that opted to receive the vaccine in the treatment and control arms. There's also the indirect effect, and this measures the effect of treatment in those who did not choose to receive the vaccine. So this is targeting those that have the interference. So the herd immunity, which is the unique aspect that clustering applies. And then there's also the overall effect, and this measures the average disease outcome amongst all individuals when a cluster is assigned to the treatment versus the control. So as I alluded to, there are some bias considerations that you need to consider when conducting a cluster randomized trial. Importantly, if possible, try to recruit or identify the patients prior to randomization, and also mask recruiters. This is to help avoid recruitment bias. This is when new participants may enter the cluster after randomization, and this can introduce the bias in that the allocation may not be concealed from recruiters and participants at that time. So because patients can flow in and flow out of the different clusters, it's best to try and mask that as much as you can. There's also a potential for identification bias. So if one of the endpoints or outcomes that is being analyzed is by a subjective review, For the person that's performing that review, if you can, try to blind them, because the characteristics of patients might be differently identified if the reviewer knows which arm they belong to. And finally, the small samples. So correlation between and within clusters is an element that's difficult to account for, and I'll dive into that a little deeper in the next slides. And a sample size calculation and small number of clusters with large variability can introduce bias into the confidence intervals and the tests that are performed. Because different clusters can be different sizes, you might want to use restricted randomization or for other elements that you would like to try and control for. Just a reminder to adjust for these in the analysis of covariates used in the randomization. And for me, one of the biggest takeaways from performing a cluster randomized trial was to try and identify the right stakeholders needed to review, approve, consult, and inform throughout the cluster randomized trial. Identifying them early will really help things move along. As I mentioned, they're very different than the individual randomized control trials, so it's good to identify those that have the knowledge to help guide the project early on. Some sample size considerations for cluster randomized trials. The biggest point is the intra-class correlation coefficient. This is when observations within a cluster may be more similar or different from those from another randomly selected cluster, leading to correlated observations within clusters, and this reduces the effective sample size. This is exacerbated if the cluster sizes that you have within your trial are not equal in size. And this correlation or non-independence of outcomes violates the assumption of assessing the effectiveness of an intervention to the control. And I'll dive into these a little bit later when I talk about the clusters and the statistical analysis. Power has a bit of a diminishing returns. So it's increased by increasing the number of clusters or increasing the cluster size. As I mentioned, you can have many clusters within the trial, and you can also have many individuals reporting to a site or a cluster that is randomized. If you have the luxury of choosing either to increase the number of clusters or the cluster sizes, which is very rare to have that luxury, but if you do, it's always better to increase the number of clusters, because the large cluster sizes can be statistically inefficient, especially if your intra-class correlation coefficient is high. If you're looking for the bare minimums, though, which I don't recommend, a cluster randomized trial can be conducted with a minimum of 8 clusters. That's 4 clusters per arm to obtain p-values less than 0.05 under a randomization-based test. But as I mentioned, a larger number of clusters is preferred. And that will help with the generalizability as well. Finally, as groups can be nested. So for example, if you have individuals reporting to a physician that reports to a ward within a hospital that's in a different region, these could all possibly be different cluster level analyses that you could perform. But to increase statistical power, it's wise to randomize them at the lowest possible level that you can get away with. So there was a paper that did a literature review of 100 cluster randomized studies, and they explored different attributes of these studies to categorize common characteristics. And I found it striking how within these 100 cluster randomized studies, there was less than 10% that had counts, time to event, and percentage data types for their primary outcomes, which means the continuous and binary were the most common data type of primary outcomes. So when you're conducting your cluster randomized trial, there's some cluster level considerations to take into consideration as well. It's recommended to pre-specify any covariates that you'd like to adjust for, and you should include the restricted randomization variables if that was part of your randomization scheme. Unlike randomized control trials, adjustment for covariates might not always increase statistical precision. However, you might have both cluster level and individual level versions of the same covariate, and it can help capture residual confounding if you include them both. As I mentioned before, if you have the luxury to increase the number of clusters, this is very, very rarely the case. And often the number of clusters is a study constraint. But if that is a hurdle you're facing, there are some ways of enhancing that statistical efficiency. For example, you could include a baseline measure of the response. So the patient is measured before and after the randomization, so you can have some of that within patient option to explore. You could have an unequal allocation of the clusters to the different treatment arms or control arms. For example, a 3-to-1 randomization. You can change the study design to include a bidirectional crossover or stepped wedge design. And there are some small sample corrections that can be done. This is taking into account the degrees of freedom penalty. And I'll dive into that a little bit later as well. There are some consort statement on cluster randomized trials. And if you're conducting one, I highly recommend checking that out. So the statistical analysis for cluster randomized trials, what can be done? In randomized control trials, the target of inference is often the individual, and statistical methods assume the outcomes from subjects are independent, but this doesn't hold for cluster randomized trials. If you ignore this, that can result in reduced standard errors, an increased value of the test statistic, smaller p-values, narrower confidence intervals. All of these increase the risk of false positives. So it's important to include the cluster into the analysis being performed. And there's several cited methods that do account for this non-independence. You could do an aggregate cluster level analysis. So this is using the aggregate summary measures for each cluster. It's a little bit more descriptive, but it is an option you could pursue. If you're interested in more individual level analyses, you can do a regression model with robust standard errors. There's also generalized linear mixed models, or GLMs, for a cluster-specific estimate. And there's also generalized estimating equations, or GEEs, and those estimate the model coefficients. A reminder that if you do pursue any imputations for missing data, these also need to appropriately allow for the clustered nature of the study design. And reflecting back to the paper that reviewed 100 different cluster randomized trials, they also reviewed the method of adjustment within these 100 studies. I found it interesting that the greatest proportion, 80%, used generalized linear mixed models. And I'd like to point out that there was still 5% that did not account for clustering in their analyses, and they used standard generalized linear models or chi-square test or anything along those lines. So if you are conducting a cluster randomized trial, please don't be one of these 5% and find a statistician to help navigate these considerations that are challenging for cluster randomized trials. So with that, I'd like to bring you to the conclusions. Cluster randomized trials are complex, and they've got several obstacles. They require larger sample size. They involve different levels in study design, measuring outcomes and analyses. They often struggle with recruitment unblinding and post-randomization and identification to the treatment allocation. However, they've got some unique benefits that differ from randomized control trials. They've got the ability to analyze cluster-level interventions. You can reduce the risk of contamination or potentially incorporate herd immunity into the study design. You can reduce costs if the access to the intervention is pricey. Statistically, you'll need to take in consideration the sample size calculation. This is really important because cluster randomized trials are more vulnerable to poor sample size estimates. The intra-class correlation coefficient is an important element of the sample size calculation, And adding more individuals to clusters has diminishing returns. So if possible, try to increase the number of clusters if you can. During the analysis, the correlation between clusters also needs to be preserved. So non-independence should be incorporated in any imputations along with the statistical analysis performed. And there are some methods for correcting for a study constraint of small number of clusters. So if you have a number of less than 40 clusters, it's encouraged to apply this small number of clusters correction. And researchers should carefully weigh the benefits and challenges of cluster randomized trials before adopting this into their study design, because they are different from randomized controlled trials, and I hope I've shared with you how they differ. But it's really important to identify the right stakeholders with the right skill sets to approve, critique, and support one of these trials if you pursue them. So here's a quick slide with my references, but we do have one more poll question for you. And I will launch that now. The poll question is, would you consider conducting a pragmatic trial for your evidence generation needs? So far, everyone has chosen, I think they have potential, but I need to learn more first. So Thomas, there might be some more presentations we can give in the future. There's also some responses. Yes, I am ready to go, which is excellent to hear. I hope that what we presented today will help support your ready to go nature on your pragmatic or cluster randomized trial.
I think that is a very good response because, they have potential. And I think, probably our presentation reflected quite well. And I think the overwhelming majority think they have potential. But yes, of course, we scratched only the surface. And I am impressed by the one who is already ready to go.
It's interesting that there's no responses for, nope, I'm happy with my clinical trials and observational studies. So I think we showcased that there is a gap. And also there's no responses to, that is nothing new to me as I conduct them already. So I think we've found an audience that is interested in learning or ready to conduct one.
2 are ready to go. That's even more exciting.
Excellent. Well, I think I will close the poll, but we can open up for some Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat area, and Thomas and I will work on replying to them. Currently, there's only one about sharing the slides, which they will be shared. Are there similarities between a pragmatic trial and an external control arm study?
I'm not really sure on that because statistically, surely not. And also from an operational point of view, I think we are talking here really about 2 very different things. Because pragmatic trials are typically clinical randomized trials for comparative effectiveness, while in an external control arm study, you do have really your observational study or your one-arm study where you try to find a suitable control from a separate data source, which is very different both operationally and statistically.
I think there's one similarity in that they're this kind of hybrid area that combines both randomized controlled trials and real world evidence. There's this hybrid space, but I feel like that might be one of the where their similarities kind of end.
Yeah, I even think the pragmatic trial concept would make it even more difficult to find suitable external controls, because here very important is that those are similar to your active study. So, and with all the diversity of pragmatic trials. So it's really difficult. At what point would you consider carrying out a pragmatic trial? That's a very interesting question, which comes very often. There's no limitation. So typically, well, the most famous pragmatic trial is a phase 3 randomized trial, the Salford lung study. But I think that is still, of course, the exception. There are a couple of phase 3 trials. There are more phase 4 or post-approval clinical trials. I know one from my area of research. I'm working quite a lot in rheumatology, and a typical question is here: are drugs more effective if the patient is under tight control or is under a more general care? So, and here that is quite a gift for cluster randomized trials, and there is one in the field of AxPAR where basically the clusters are, or the interventions are, tight controlled patients versus standard care patients. So that is a classic example of a pragmatic trial. Of course, that is when post-approval, that is during the life cycle, the more early phase probably of a life cycle, because here it is about positioning and giving the healthcare provider and the physician a strategy at hand how to work with the drug. So I think that are typical examples for pragmatic trials where they can be very useful. Market access is a still difficult topic, but as I mentioned earlier, market access authority are interested, also because of the pressure they face from politics. So I would say rarely in phase 3, but already used in phase 3, and then into the early life cycle of approved drugs. That is probably currently the span where you can find pragmatic trials.
So I think there's another question for you, Thomas. Thanks, Thomas, for a nice explanation about pragmatic trials. Could you give examples of insensitive when to select them? I'm not sure if there's a typo there, except for cluster randomized trials.
Oh, that's difficult. Insensitive to select them. I don't know really. I think because of their flexibility, they have a very broad applicability. I probably would think they are more applicable when it comes to comparative effectiveness compared, for example, to safety. So, and I don't actually know very many safety study examples where pragmatic trials were run. But in principle, actually, I would not really say there are examples where it is insensitive to select them because of their flexibility. Does that answer?
I hope so, because we just have a few minutes left. So I think I'm going to close the Q&A section now. And I'm going to hand over the mic, I guess, to Andrew, who is just going to finalize the webinar for